Welcome to Convocations again today. We are lucky to have Charlotte Hansen Terry speak to us. Her talk is called Becoming an American in the Pacific. So Charlotte Terry Hansen is a PhD candidate in U.S. history at the University of California in Davis. And her dissertation is titled Mormons, Pacific Islanders, and the Boundaries of Belonging in the Age of Empire. It explores Mormon missionization efforts during the 19th century and early 20th centuries and responses to these efforts by Pacific Islanders and their governments, the U.S. imperial agents and other missionary organizations. So, currently, Charlotte is also working for the University of Utah. She is a fellow in the Tanner Humanities Department at the University of Utah, and we look forward to her exploration of this topic today. So let's give a round of applause for our speaker.
First of all, okay, good, the mic's working, that's good. I'm really excited to be here with you today. Thanks, Eric, for inviting me to give this talk. It's been a great opportunity to kind of be thinking through as I'm revising and working on my dissertation and kind of thinking about going forward with it. And before I really dive into what I'm going to be focusing on this topic of becoming American in the Pacific, I want to explain my position in relation to my scholarship. So I grew up in northern Utah, and I'm the descendant of white Mormon settlers who came to the United States in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So my ancestors were settlers who lived on native lands throughout the North American West, particularly Shoshone, Paiute, Goshute, and Ute lands. I have ancestors who participated in missionizing efforts in the United States and in the Pacific. So that past informs who I am and how I'm approaching my scholarship and what I'm doing. I also want to acknowledge the place that I've attended school for the past few years, and that's in Northern California and what's the home of the Patwin people. And for this project, I've conducted research in various places in the North American West, mainly Utah and California, but I've also done some research in Hawaii and Aotearoa, which is New Zealand. So place matters in how we understand the world and how we approach our scholarship, and that is certainly the case for my project. So there's a native scholar, an Anishinaabe scholar, Lawrence Gross, and he talks in his book, Anishinaabe Ways of Knowing and Being. He teaches students about religious traditions, and he asks them to think about what kind of human beings a given tradition is trying to create and what a religious tradition is rooted in. So this book and others on indigenous worldviews and beliefs have informed how I study religion and then also how I consider my own history. Indigenous scholars and others doing indigenous history have done significant work on the history of colonialism within the Latter-day Saint tradition. Yet the LDS faith has not grappled with its colonial past and its continued imperial practices across the globe. So I build on the work of these scholars and work to reveal the roots of these practices and provide a better understanding of how these practices continue to influence the problematic hierarchies within this American faith tradition. So for today, I'm going to be focusing on the process of Americanization for white Mormons in the Pacific. But before I jump into that topic, I'm going to give an overview of my whole project. I think it helps understand, again, the main theme for what I'm doing today. So my dissertation explores Mormon missionization efforts during the 19th and the early 20th centuries, and then responses to these efforts by Pacific Islanders and their governments, the U.S. imperial agents, and other missionary organizations. I trace how white Mormon missionaries and then Pacific Islanders considered their affiliations one with another. And I also look at their attempts to define and expand some certain themes of belonging, and that's racial, religious, familial, and national belonging. My work builds on current scholarship that shows why the Pacific is important for understanding the North American West. So Indigenous Pacific Studies challenges the historical framings that we usually have for the Pacific region. Very often when we think about the Pacific, and that's why I put this map up here, it's a very large space. And we very often think of it as just this ocean and maybe some edges of continents, including what we see as the United States today. But a lot of these indigenous scholars encourage scholars to see how the Pacific is not just connected by the ocean, the islands, and the edges of continents, but also through currents, migrations, and water flows. Studies which show the connections between the North American West and the Pacific are important to understanding U.S. colonization and who was incorporated or assimilated and who was not into the U.S. body politic. So to understand the U.S. West, where we actually are right now, we cannot just stop at the coast of California, but need to consider the region in relation to the Pacific. So my project examines missionary efforts and responses to them to explore 4 categories of belonging: nation, race, family, and religion. With nation, I give some context with that. As the United States empire grew, officials had to balance their desire for expansion against the cost of colonizing racialized others. And if you've taken history classes, this is very often talked about with how different white settlers had to grapple with native peoples as they claimed different places in the North America. U.S. agents continually attempted to change indigenous peoples' practices and labeled them as racially other as this empire stretched across the continent and then beyond. And during this same period in the United States, historian Paul Reeve, who's at the University of Utah, argues Latter-day Saints were seen as marginally white and degraded. So they were not fully civilized because they practiced polygamy and had lost their claim to whiteness as a result. So the 19th century was a difficult period for the LDS faith as U.S. officials attempted to change their religious practices. Now, throughout this period where U.S. officials challenged these Mormon practices, church leaders continued to send missionaries across the globe. Latter-day Saint leaders first sent missionaries to the Pacific in 1843 to French Polynesia. And then white Mormon missionaries arrived in Hawaii in 1850, which is circled at the top towards that map, Australia in 1851, New Zealand in 1854, again, the circle towards the bottom of the map. But they didn't actually make concerted efforts amongst Maori until the 1880s. And then Samoa, which I've circled in the middle, in 1888. So for my dissertation, I focus on Hawaii, New Zealand, and Samoa. Amanda Hendricks-Komodo, who was here a few weeks ago, she's done really important work on looking at French Polynesia. So if you're curious about that, you can look into the book she was talking to you about as well. So white Mormon missionary efforts amongst Kanaka Maoli, or Native Hawaiians, Maori, and Samoans show how the Mormon Church both attempted to bring converts into a Mormon community and kingdom, but also how Mormons became more connected to the United States and other imperial powers. Since U.S. imperialism relied on churches and missionaries for them to do the colonial administration that they needed to, studying Mormon missionaries improves our understanding of U.S. colonization, both in the North American West and also in the Pacific Islands. So bringing Mormon history into conversation with history of U.S. colonialism and using a transnational lens. And what that usually means is you're comparing what's happening in different nations and seeing how they can impact one another. This reperiodizes the longer process of Mormon assimilation into the United States. I'll come back to what I mean by that in a moment, because that's the main focus of today's talk. So another category for my dissertation is with race. So encounters between LDS missionaries and Pacific Islanders reveal how religion complicated construction of racial categories and ideas of racial belonging. So my dissertation looks at the construction of Lamanite as a racial category in the Pacific. So the LDS Church claimed that the Book of Mormon was an ancient text written by descendants of people who had traveled to the Americas from Israel before the time of Christ. Church leaders stated that Native Americans were descendants of the people in the Book of Mormon and called them Lamanites, and argued that they were part of the house of Israel. They used this belief to justify missionary effort to Native Americans. Fort Peck Assiniboine and Sioux scholar Elise Boxer argues that the construction of a Lamanite identity gave Mormon settlers justification to remove and dispossess indigenous peoples, and that happens across the Utah Territory. As LDS missionaries encountered Pacific Islanders, then they grappled with where they were going to put Pacific Islanders within these racial categories that they were forming. So I trace in my dissertation how Kanaka Maoli, or Native Hawaiians, and Mormon missionaries worked together to be adding the people of the Pacific into this category of Lamanite, and then how this process also then occurred in New Zealand and in Samoa. So white Mormons expanded their visions of who was included amongst God's chosen people even though they did not see everyone equal and ranked the various indigenous peoples they encountered to create this racial hierarchy within Lamanite. So this means that they placed people in the Pacific actually above Native Americans in their framing, but then as they were going through the Pacific, anytime they came to a new set of islands, they had to decide where these people would fit in their racial categories. So very often they talked about like, oh, well, we think the Hawaiians are a little bit better than this group, but then we think Samoans are better than Hawaiians, or whatever those kinds of like hierarchies they would create within it. So here on the slide, you can see an image attached to an article about Samoa in the 19th century magazine for Mormon children. So again, they're having these ethnographic discussions, even with children's magazines. Despite these framings, Pacific Islanders themselves articulated their own conceptions and found meaning and connections with this category with other Pacific Islanders. Mormon missionaries started to also bring children with them from the Pacific, many of whom were Pacific Islanders, and I trace how this practice changed over time. And there were different ideas of what the incorporation of these children might look like into different households, and different reasons for these migrations. Children often acted as intermediaries in the Mormon civilizing process, particularly with schooling, even as they and their families had their own motivations to improve their educational opportunities. Some were adopted, while others were sponsored until their families could join them in the North American West. Others were wanted for their labor or to fulfill the emotional needs of families. Some of these children were commodified and seen as something exotic to collect from far-off mission fields. And various government officials believed these children were possibly pawns or hostages, being used to encourage more people to move to Utah. So the incorporation of Pacific Islander children into white Mormon households complicated these Mormon attempts to expand the boundaries of who they belonged in their religion. And it made it so there was increased tensions both with the United States and Pacific nations because towards the end of the 19th century specifically. And this photograph is an example of one of the children I found that this happened with. Her name is Rachel Lesiali Giles. And you can see her family on the left with the missionary she came back with. His name was Elder William Canuck Hunter. She went with Hunter to Utah for school. She was stopped and questioned by immigration officials in 1894, but was allowed to continue to Utah and lived with Hunter's family near Cedar City. So you can actually see her on the right with his family. Finally, I explore how Pacific Islanders carefully considered their own affiliation with Latter-day Saint religious practices. White Mormon missionaries had to adjust their practices to meet the needs and protocols of Kanaka Maoli, Maori, and Samoans. As Maori scholar Selwyn Katane told me this past summer, the church was successful in New Zealand because it was seen as more transformational and equitable than transactional. Since it relied so heavily on local people, it became a Maori church, is what he said. This also occurred in Hawaii and Samoa, as Native members found meaning and belonging within the church, even if white Mormon leaders at times had other motivations or intentions that aligned them more with imperial powers and colonization efforts. So Mormonism ingrained itself in the Pacific. It constructed its first temple outside of North America in Hawaii, which you see on the slide here, in the early 20th century, and established permanent schools in Hawaii and New Zealand. Yet, even as LDS leaders and Pacific Islanders said that Pacific Islanders were chosen people, white Mormons wanted to keep them separate and discouraged extensive migrations to Utah and the surrounding region. And if you've heard about it, there's this place called Yosepa, which is this Native Hawaiian community in Utah. It's about 60 miles west of Salt Lake City near Tooele. And it existed for almost 30 years, but it was abandoned, and most of the Hawaiians returned to the Pacific once the church constructed the Hawaiian temple. You can see in this image, it's some Yosepa residents celebrating Pioneer Day in 1914. So, following these themes of racial, religious, and familial and national belonging, my dissertation is looking at how Mormonism created certain connections between the U.S. West and the Pacific. So, Mormons believed they had this universal message that worked across national borders, a message that brought all into God's kingdom. And they connected Pacific Islanders to Native Americans, and that particular racial category of Lamanite. But Mormonism also reinforced and created variations on other boundaries, from their racial constructions to their support of colonial efforts and their limitations on migration from the Pacific to gather in Utah. So for the rest of my talk, I'm going to look more closely at that theme of national belonging in my project. So Mormon missionization in the Pacific adjusts how we understand the process of Americanization for white Mormons, and I'm going to explain what I mean. During the 19th century, many reform organizations, as well as government officials, saw the LDS faith as degraded and uncivilized, again because of its religious practices, particularly polygamy. And they accused Mormons of working against American democracy and citizenship. Church leaders finally conceded to federal demands and relinquished the practice of polygamy, at least officially, in the United States in 1890. This year is often viewed as an important turning point in Mormon assimilation into the United States. Though the church continued to be in this kind of fragile position, tenuous position in relation to the US government, as many continually questioned Mormon allegiance to the United States in territorial Utah. So Mormon missionization in the Pacific adds an additional layer to that story about how, where, and when Americanization occurred for white Mormons. It didn't just take place in the US West, in Utah where we are now, and that process of Americanization began earlier than the period that's usually identified. Usually it's seen as this moment from about the 1890 when polygamy officially ended until about 1920. Mormons were subjects of empire at home in the North American West, as the US government attempted to change their religious practices, but they were often agents of empire abroad in the same period. It was through encounters with indigenous peoples that Mormons established their identities as white US imperialists, making it easier for them to be then incorporated into the nation. So during the 1840s and 1850s, to kind of see how that transition happens over the 19th century, LDS leaders and missionaries wanted to bring converts into a Mormon community and a Mormon kingdom or a Mormon empire. As Amanda Hendricks-Komodo, who again was here a few weeks ago, and Lori Maffley-Kipp have argued, Mormons in the American West and Pacific positioned themselves against existing imperial systems. Mormons saw themselves as victims of US imperialism. As they worked amongst Pacific Islanders, they believed they provided an alternative religious community to those that are marginalized by the Protestant and Catholic missionaries that had been in the Pacific for decades. And they felt a connection in certain respects with those they taught, pulling on the shared legacy of discrimination by saying, we've had to experience this in the American West, we can understand what you're experiencing with these different empires in the Pacific. So LDS missionaries first arrived in Hawaii in 1850. Their work in Hawaii was actually originally meant to be a temporary assignment during the winter months away from labor in the gold fields, actually in California. So though these first missionaries originally intended only to teach white people, they learned there were few whites on the islands, and some of the early missionaries then started to learn Hawaiian and attempted to teach Native Hawaiians or Kanaka Maoli. Though not the focus of this presentation, I explain in my larger project how Kanaka Maoli and white Mormon missionaries, particularly George Buchanan, who's up on the slide here, made the claim that Native Hawaiians were part of the House of Israel and connected with the Book of Mormon. Some Native Hawaiians eventually embraced the idea of being connected with the Book of Mormon, of spiritual gifts and healings that Mormons practiced, and of the priesthood offices that Latter-day Saints offered. Since white Mormon missionaries had little money, they also lived amongst the Hawaiians, and Kanaka Maoli converts became essential to the success of Mormonism there. Protestant missionaries who were closely connected with the Hawaiian government and held positions in it, and then Catholic priests became concerned with these Mormon incursions into a place that they'd again been for decades. So they quickly organized, along with certain Hawaiian chiefs and local tribunals, to threaten anyone who spoke to the Mormon missionaries or joined their church. These threats led leaders to appeal to the Hawaiian government. They first went in person to meet with the Hawaiian government leaders, and then wrote an official petition where they said, and there's some of the quote up on the slide, that they'd come to these islands to promulgate the gospel, and as our intent to preach nothing but what is contained in the Christian Bible, as set forth in the published laws of this government, respectfully asked to be protected in our rights in common with all other Christian denominations. They referred to the Hawaiian laws constituted by King Kamehameha III that allowed religions on the islands who worshiped the God of the Christian Bible and did not preach anything of immoral character or improper conduct. But the missionaries felt the Hawaiian officials were not taking their case seriously. So they also approached the U.S. commissioner and his name was Luther Severance. And he wrote letters to Hawaiian officials asking for the execution of the laws of the kingdom and to support these citizens of the United States in their missionary labors as they fell under the protection provided by Christian denominations. So Hawaiian officials responded and said that as long as the missionaries continued to respect the laws, they would be entitled to protection and could get protection through proper channels with the government. So it's interesting because in Hawaii, white Mormon missionaries were willing to claim their position as Americans even though they did not approve of U.S. government actions. So many of these same missionaries wrote in their journals about how they believed the United States had fallen away from its founding principles, the U.S. officials did not follow the Constitution. Even as missionaries said they did not want to make connections with certain imperial systems, they would use the connections as much as they would provide the protection that they needed to open up the way for their missionary work and make it possible for their expansion of their kingdom of God. Since mission leaders were separated from church headquarters and would not receive communications often for months at a time, especially in the 1850s, they had to rely on whatever connections they could make and whatever resources were at their disposal, including U.S. government representatives. White Mormons still viewed the Hawaiian and the U.S. government with a level of suspicion. Though they continued to portray themselves as fitting within the parameters of Christian traditions on the Hawaiian Islands, they encountered obstacles when church leaders publicly announced the practice of polygamy, and that happened in 1852. This led the Hawaiian kingdom to deny Mormon missionaries marriage licenses, despite their repeated attempts over the 1850s and 60s to get that revoked. And Hawaiian officials then said the practice of polygamy was contrary to the laws of the Hawaiian kingdom, and that meant that Latter-day Saints did not teach from the Christian Bible, they said. So polygamy was mentioned consistently as a concern in warnings from ministers, in pamphlets, and in government minutes. As the Mormon elders perceived increased limitation on their proselyting, they not only critiqued government leaders and ministers, but then started to predict their downfall. So the mission president said that the government was on the eve of revolution and critiqued the king and the officials and their power over the common people. Mormon missionaries wrote heated letters to Hawaiian officials saying that polygamy was in the Christian Bible and that if the officials would not permit Mormons to perform marriages and obstructed what they said was the work of the God of Israel, they would soon see the great calamity that will come upon them. Because of corruption that they saw in the Hawaiian government, Mormon missionaries then increased talk of gathering the saints to the North American West. But there were immigration restrictions for the Hawaiian kingdom that made this impossible. Some missionaries believed that if the Hawaiian government was actually overthrown, it would make it possible for them to gather the saints off the islands in order to save them. But until that occurred, Mormons established a separate gathering place for Hawaiian members in Hawaii at Lanai in 1854. So a prominent Hawaiian member who's up here on the slide, Jonatana H. Napela, wrote the king inviting him to join the Mormons at this new settlement because he said destruction was going to visit this government and the earth. Just as in the U.S. West, Mormons wanted to gather separately as they believed in approaching destruction for the corrupt governments of the earth, and this was a sentiment that then some of their Hawaiian converts, like Napela, came to share. When Lanai started as a settlement in 1854, the LDS Church was at a peak on the Hawaiian Islands. Yet by 1858, only 4 years later, all the white Mormon missionaries had left Hawaii, not sure if they would ever return. Many factors contributed to this change. Lanai quickly ran into difficulties. Many Kanaka Maoli became disillusioned with the church, and the politics in Utah with the Utah War actually resulted in Mormon missionaries being called back from across the globe. So Mormons again had their own kingdom to defend in the West. During this same period that Brigham Young here in Utah was calling back these missionaries, the Hawaiian government expressed increasing concern that Mormons would leave the Utah territory and possibly choose to settle in the Pacific and try to take over the Hawaiian Islands themselves. So the Secretary of War in his report to the Hawaiian legislature talked about this increased threat of Mormon invasion and that the Mormons looked to these islands as the place whereunto their next exodus is to be directed. Now, this invasion didn't happen, and at the same time that this report was given, the last white elders were leaving the islands. But this report shows that the Hawaiian government leaders had serious concerns about this Mormon kingdom and were paying attention to what was happening in the North American West. Mormon connections with these imperial powers then, after the 1850s, starting into the 60s and then 70s and 80s, shifted. And Mormons continued to struggle with the U.S. government, and polygamy obviously caused problems in the United States, but also with missionary work across the globe. Despite all this, Mormons continued to have success in the Pacific, particularly amongst Pacific Islanders. Kanaka Maoli and Maori found their own meaning and sense of belonging within the faith, and Pacific Islanders found a way to align spiritual gifts and priesthood with traditional beliefs. In Hawaii, at a new gathering place in Laie, starting in 1864, and there's an image up on the slide of that place, Kanaka Maoli scholar Hokolani Aikau argues that Kanaka Maoli saw Laie as a place of refuge in the aftermath of the set of procedures that had privatized land on the island starting in the 1840s. The recently crowned Hawaiian king and queen visited Laie in 1874, and they praised the industriousness of the people and also the increase in the Hawaiian population, which the king emphasized as a major goal of his reign to combat the incursion of foreign influences. And this happened in a lot of places where when they had different foreigners that were coming into an area because of disease or other things, there was a decrease in population. One of the white missionaries responded to the remarks of the king and said that the object of the mission was, quote, solely to regenerate the race by teaching them the principles of the true gospel, habits of industry, frugality, and cleanliness. A few months later, after his visit to Laie, the Hawaiian king, King Kalakaua, visited the United States for a few months to improve relations with the U.S. and to influence trade and tariff agreements. And during this trip, he stopped in lots of different places across the United States, including a really quick stop in Ogden, Utah. He commented that the industriousness of Utahns was well known, and he hoped that the fact residents had transformed the desert into a productive landscape would encourage his subjects to do the same. Even, they had obviously a much more lush place on the islands, but he saw that these ideas could be implemented on the islands. And he looked forward to like a mutual exchange of products, both with people in the United States, but specifically with the Mormons themselves. He welcomed the citizens of Utah to his kingdom, and he said this: as their habits of industry, combined with their valuable principle of cooperation for the common benefit, could not fail to present a useful example for my people to follow in these respects. He encouraged an exchange of products and ideas with Mormons, and the king saw the Mormons as part of the United States, obviously, in their ideals, since he was visiting Utah through this visit through the United States. But he also praised Mormons specifically for what they could provide for his kingdom. Mormon missionaries started to proselyte in New Zealand in the 1850s, but they didn't make a concerted effort amongst the Maori until the 1880s. Now, Maori saw Mormon missionaries very differently than the Protestant missionaries who had been there, again, for decades. Mormon missionaries lived amongst the Maori, learned their language, embraced and celebrated the prophecies of their Maori prophets, and unlike the Protestant missionaries who had been there for decades, they had no desire to take Maori land. Protestant missionaries by this time, in contrast, were associated with the land grabs of the British Empire. New Zealand government officials paid attention to this new focus of the Mormon missionaries as well as they started to teach Maori, and reported to the New Zealand Parliament that there were a lot of Maori that were joining Mormonism. They said they believed the Mormons preached amongst the Maoris was more beneficial, they said, than otherwise, since they encouraged no drinking and did not advocate polygamy, at least by the 1880s in New Zealand. They believed they were doing good work among the people, including with establishing schools. So it's interesting because British government officials praised Mormons at the same time that Maori found Mormonism appealing because of how it was distinct from the people they associated with the British Empire. Imperial powers and the Hawaiian Kingdom both started to see Mormon missionaries as less of a threat as they focused on what would be called civilizing efforts. So in Hawaii, New Zealand, and then later in Samoa, the Mormon schools were the most successful and long-lasting, especially when they had training from trained school teachers running them. And so Mormon leaders learned quickly the importance of these schools for their affiliation with these different governments, and that a lot of the native people in the Pacific were interested in them, and so they started actually recruiting teachers specifically to go out and be teaching in some of these places because they saw it as helping with their missionary work. These women and men that were trained in the US West then became these important in teaching specifically English in the Pacific. And Mormons started English schools and taught Western forms of agriculture and sewing. And again, this is very similar to other missionary groups. Mormons are not distinct in this way. But as they did so, Mormons participated in imperial efforts. They're using imperial tactics, which again is helping them to be seen as part of this more larger imperial project. So by doing so, Mormon missionaries started to belong alongside other colonial forces. And it actually became a practice to have polygamists who were hiding from the US government called on missions outside of the United States, particularly to Hawaii in the 1880s. So by the 1890s, LDS church leaders celebrated the fact that there were congregations across the globe. There's a prominent female church leader and suffragist, Emmeline B. Wells, and she repeatedly acknowledged the global nature of the women's organization in the church, which was called the Relief Society. She often mentioned congregations throughout Europe, but also in Hawaii, Samoa, Australia, and New Zealand to show that they had this international organization, one with great communications that benefited all its members. She said their women's organization, and then therefore the LDS Church at large, had almost made a band around the world, one that linked in all its several branches in one great whole, one almost perfect circle. Beginning in Illinois on the banks of the Mississippi, it has gone westward into the fastnesses of the Rocky Mountains and southwest into the Sandwich Islands, and from thence to Samoa and across the continent, thence east to the kingdoms of Europe, taking in Great Britain and Holland, the countries of Scandinavia, Germany, and Switzerland to Asia Minor, extending southward to Australia, Tasmania, and New Zealand. By portraying itself as a global faith, LDS leaders could argue for the legitimacy of their religious imperial project, one that was again expanding across the globe. It was during this period of increased celebration of itself as a global faith that white Mormon missionaries reached Samoa. And it was also in Samoa that white Mormon missionaries were able to claim an even stronger American identity than they had in the previous decades. The first white missionaries, Florence and Joseph Dean, took a winding path to get to Samoa. In March 1887, Joseph had just finished time in a Utah prison for suspicion of practicing polygamy, and it was true because Florence was his second wife and had remained in hiding since their marriage in 1885. In order to keep Joseph out of prison and put his skills to use, LDS leaders decided to send the Deans on a mission outside of the United States, away from US government officials who were searching for him. Joseph's first wife remained in Utah. Florence and Joseph departed for their mission in May of 1887, Joseph traveling in disguise on horseback with like a weird hairdo apparently, he talks about in his journal, and Florence taking the train from Ogden to San Francisco to meet him. The Deans first went to Hawaii, where Joseph had already served a mission, and then they went on to Samoa. When Joseph and Florence Dean arrived, they encountered a native Samoan population who was already mostly Christian. This is, again, what Mormon missionaries had encountered when they were in all these different places in the Pacific, both in Hawaii and New Zealand. And most Samoans were already affiliated with a missionary group called the London Missionary Society, which had arrived in Samoa in the 1820s, so they'd been there for 60 plus years. In many ways, Mormons again followed the practices of other Christian missionaries in Samoa, but these missionaries also again tried to show the distinctness of their message, talking about the Book of Mormon, and then also connecting the Samoans with the Lamanites they discussed in that text. Mormon missionaries affiliated themselves with the US government representatives on the islands. They did this to protect their interests because other missionary groups, again, and as well as the Germans, were concerned with this upsurge in missionary work and attempted to thwart their efforts. So this again happened on any island group they went to. These gestures to make the US consul aware of their presence was telling. Considering Joseph Dean had left Utah in order to escape the federal government and avoid imprisonment for being a polygamist, there was a certain irony in Dean turning to the US officials in Samoa for support. So claiming an American identity in Samoa could lead to a protection of missionary efforts. So just as in Hawaii 40 years before, Mormon missionaries had learned over the years the importance of making connections with government officials when they were separated from the Mormon center of power in Utah. And since Dean had also served a mission in Hawaii, he'd likely learned from the practices of the missionaries in Hawaii what might be a good way to approach the situation in Samoa. Over time, missionaries' cultivation of the relationship with the US consulate in Samoa led to some important results in the eyes of Mormon leaders on the larger U.S. international stage. An incident with Mormon missionaries became central to a process where the U.S. government's decision to increase their military presence in Samoa. So some native Samoans raided a missionary home in Apia in 1896, even though there were actually 2 American flags above the pulpit. Mormon missionaries went to the U.S. Consul General, his name was William Churchill, to ask for assistance in receiving reparations for the damages. Now, this incident occurred during a period when there were continued debates within the United States about whether the nation should be involved in Samoa at all. During the 1890s, there was something called a tripartite condominium that tried to keep things in order, as both the United States, but then various European powers were trying to continue the trade and purchasing of lands on the Samoan Islands. But this meant you had various imperial powers involved in this place, and then the Samoans themselves, leading to a lot of tension about this situation. The State Department, and then the president at the time was Cleveland, were slow to protect U.S. citizens abroad and did not follow through with this case with the Mormon missionaries. But Churchill, who had been at the consulate in Samoa, he went to Washington, D.C. after his tenure as the Consul General to ask officials in the new McKinley administration, because there were a lot of changes in the presidency in the 1890s, why the case had been dropped. Churchill said that the missionaries composed the majority of what he would call real American citizens in Samoa, and he observed that the missionaries were an upright and respected set of men, and that they were to be taken to be representative American citizens. He believed the Samoans had intentionally targeted the Mormon missionaries because they were seen as Americans. So, to native Samoans, the Mormons were American representatives. And if the administration did not respond, then the United States would not be taken seriously on the islands, is what this consulate said. The State Department responded by sending a warship, which you can see here on this image. When we think warships, we think very different now with these like very large guns, but this is what a warship would have looked like in the 1890s. To the Apia Harbor in Samoa to instill some more respect for the U.S. government and its citizens. Now, for LDS officials, this set an important precedent. People in countries across the globe in the 1890s had mistreated LDS missionaries, Mormon leaders had said, and they'd asked their government to help them find redress, but had not received assistance. But now they saw that this was a brighter future. They saw that the fact that the U.S. government assisted in Samoa, that this would be, quote, notice to all the world that Mormons who are American citizens will be protected by their own government when in foreign countries, the same as are other subjects of the United States, regardless of church affiliation. Only a few years earlier, some of these same Mormon leaders had been critiquing U.S. officials for being very un-American in their treatment of Mormon missionaries. So it's interesting, again, these shifts that are happening in the 1890s. So at least on the international stage in the Pacific, Mormons were seen as legitimate subjects, at least to an extent. This incident occurred, again, during the same period when Utah gained statehood. Utah gained statehood in 1896, so this is all kind of happening in the same kind of moment. And Mormon leaders were working again to align their national practices and be admitted to the Union. Yet, LDS missionaries found they still fell short in claiming a full American identity. Following a conflict between the U.S. and German-backed factions in 1899 in Samoa, the United States and German officials organized a ceremonial flag-raising ceremony to celebrate the restoration of peace and the new divisions of power on the islands. So in this moment, they divided the islands between Germany and the United States. Mormon missionaries were present in both ceremonies, but not allowed to participate in the celebrations in a significant way. At the event for hoisting the U.S. flag on the island of Tutuila, the London Missionary Society read a prayer and a Catholic priest blessed the flag. LDS missionaries were not allowed to participate. And one missionary present pointed out that they, quote, the only full-fledged Americans who reside here, outside of the governor's hands, were allowed to take no part in the important event. These missionaries remained behind after everyone had left and after their own prayer, quote, that God would bless the stars and stripes which is spreading from sea to sea. These missionaries expressed frustration with being left out of festivities and not being completely trusted or seen as legitimate. Even if U.S. officials recognized Mormon missionaries as U.S. citizens, some local government officials still did not see them as truly Christian. But by this act of their own prayer, these missionaries created their own way of belonging. Yes, they desired official recognition from the government leaders of their position as U.S. citizens and as religious missionaries. Yet even when that was not recognized, they stepped into that space to create belonging of their own and lay claim to the ideas of a spreading U.S. empire. Mormon missionaries show the tension that existed between being subjects of empire at home and agents of empire abroad. So being both subjects and agents led Mormon missionaries to adopt additional American positions, particularly imperial framings of the world. Mormons wanted to belong to a certain extent to the U.S. body politic, to be seen as white and Christian and American. Since these categories were dependent on one another, it made it difficult for Mormons to claim their full American identity without achieving all three. But their attempts to do so shaped their Mormon identity. Mormon missionary work was an imperial project, and it aligned Mormon leaders and missionaries with U.S. imperial efforts, which all led to a more solidified American identity for white Mormons by the end of the 19th century, even if that identity was still tenuous. So, in conclusion, people in the United States continue to grapple with the relationship of this nation to others, as well as this long history of U.S. imperialism. Studies of the North American West and the Pacific are important to understanding U.S. colonization. These studies help us understand who was incorporated and assimilated and who was not into the U.S. body politic. As we look at conceptions of belonging alongside these larger trends of colonization and imperialism, we can see more clearly various systems of oppression and exclusion, but also how various peoples found meaning and connection within these systems as well. So my project tries to work with that and traces how white Mormon missionaries and Pacific Islanders considered their affiliations both with one another and also their attempts to define and expand these thematic ideas of belonging that I look at. Encounters between white Mormons and Pacific Islanders help us to better understand the challenges these groups experienced, defining the boundaries of these categories of race, family, religion, and nation during the 19th and early 20th centuries. So I look forward to your questions and talking to you more about what I just presented. So.
All right. It looks like we have about
7-ish minutes?
Yeah, it's about 7 minutes for questions. So maybe just while I'll let you take this microphone, but maybe just think while Tassi gets to the other side of the room, just think about questions you might want to ask.
Thank you so much for your presentation. How much has your research involved? I mean, obviously archival work and recovering a lot of these details from the record there. But I'm also curious, it's taken you to some of these places in person. What role have interviews played, if any? What role have, talking with people in these communities now? I know you're looking at mainly 19th century, how this looked there, but I'm curious, even if informally, what things have you picked up in the process in conversations with people, or their recollection of, in terms of their family history, or the shape of these things in some of these communities now? I know that's a big question, but if you want to speak to any part of that, from kind of firsthand stuff you've looked at as well.
Yeah, it's a great question too. So I think it's really important for historians, as much as they can, to go to the places that they're studying. It's not always possible, and luckily I've been able to get some funding to make that possible. And so yes, I've been able to have interactions with a lot of different Pacific Islanders, some that I already knew and was friends with, but then extending those networks as I've talked to other scholars and other people. So for instance, I even talked about Selwyn Katane, who's a Maori scholar. I met with him for hours one day while I was in Wellington, and then I went and spent a whole day with his family and got to talk to them about it and got some really helpful insights from them. He's 4th or 5th generation member Mormon in his family because they joined in the 1880s. And so hearing his insights and how he was framing things was really helpful for me. I've done the same thing when I was in Hawaii and some other spaces as well. And I'm working on continuing to make those connections because it is really important. Because some people, like you said, like their family traditions or other things have that rooted memory. One of the things that came up with talking to some Hawaiians specifically that I was friends with as well was when I was talking about these adoptions or these children that came to the North American West, she expressed to me the urgency of finding their stories and where they ended up, because some of them might have been lost to their families or, like what that story looked like. And so also increased the gravity of thinking about what that means. Like this isn't just, we think very often of something that's very long ago, like this thing that happened like in the mid-19th century. This is over 150 years ago. Does it matter to this current moment? But these have impacted, if you're familiar or have grown up in Utah, there's a large Pacific Islander population in Utah. And the work that I'm looking at, that Amanda's looking at, even Eric is looking at, is part of why that happens, that there's these large populations in this state. And so trying to see where that's starting, what's impacting it, how that influences how we see things even now is really important, I think. And so the plan is to continue to increase those contacts, and especially now that I'm back here in Utah because I'm on a fellowship this year, there's a lot of people here too, that this is potentially where they ended up here in Utah as well. So lots more work to do, but I've started at least, and it's been really helpful to kind of see what matters to people when I've talked to them about the project, yeah. Thank you for that question, that was great.
Hi, so was there like a specific story or something that as you're researching that stood out to you?
That's a great question too. I didn't use it as much today, but I'll go back to the children that came to the American West. It's something that continues to kind of tug at me. I did a presentation a couple weeks ago, and their stories are really interesting to be thinking about. The one from this one today is, I think the deans are hilarious to me. Because I read his diary, and I love how he's like complaining in his diary about these U.S. officials and then talking about these disguises to like sneakily make his way to California and like make his way to the Pacific. And it's just really funny to be thinking about people like trying to like run away from weird government officials in the 1880s during polygamy, and it just brought it to life in these really interesting ways. That story was, when I started doing this, was just really interesting to just think about through this specific family, like what you can see, right? And another weird fact about his diary too, and this happened with a few missionaries that had served in Hawaii that were polygamists, they would write in their diaries in Hawaiian, so that if government officials grabbed their diaries, they write about it if they were visiting an extra wife, so that U.S. officials in Utah wouldn't know that they'd visited their wife, because it would be in a different language. So it's kind of interesting to think about how this missionary work, in a weird way in the Pacific, kind of made it easier for them to kind of hide their polygamy, but not really. So it's, again, really compelling sometimes reading these diaries, which a lot of them have been digitized, where it's like it all of a sudden just switches into Hawaiian. And you're like, oh, you must have just visited your second or third wife for the evening, and you didn't want the government officials to use your diary in their court case. Anyway, weird stuff like that, so.
Maybe time for one more question. Okay, if not, I will ask one, because this came up in a conversation that I had with one of the students earlier today, just about in general for academic presentations. Is there one kind of real life takeaway that you think is most significant about your research?
Yeah, great question. So I love doing history work because it helps us to think about how we're here in this moment, but what that looks like for who belongs and what we think of as the United States. What does it actually mean to be American? So very often when I teach U.S. history classes, I think about this idea. What does it mean to be American? How does that change over time? And so I think for my work, that helps to kind of give another lens to that picture of like, what does that mean, and how does that mean people have changed, or what impacts what is seen as American, and who gets to be part of that that category and who doesn't, right? And that's something that wasn't just something that people discussed in the 19th century. That is still something we very much talk about not just in history, but in our current moment of like who belongs and who doesn't. And what does that mean about who decides what those boundaries are of who belongs and who doesn't, in many different ways in our society. And so very often I find it interesting to study these things in the past because of the fact that it helps us see how those boundaries were constructed in that moment and how they have changed. Meaning that the boundaries that we have in our society now, that's not set in stone either. And so it's interesting to see how that's changed over time, and I think that's why it can be an interesting thing to study, because it matters now too. So.
Well, thanks so much. Let's give our presenter one last round of applause, and thanks everybody for coming today. And we'll be around for minutes a couple minutes if you need to talk to me, or if you want to talk with Charlotte.